Peace be upon you, and welcome to a new episode. On January 16, 2011, a father received a phone call from an unknown number. As soon as he answered, the caller spoke to him directly and told him that he had kidnapped his son and was holding him captive. He demanded that the father bring a ransom amount. At that moment, the father told him that he would do everything he wanted, but he just wanted reassurance about his son. However, the person on the other end abruptly ended the call. The father was at a loss about what to do. First, he tried calling his son's phone, but as soon as he dialed, he discovered that the phone was switched off. That's when he realized that the caller might have been telling the truth and that his son was indeed being held hostage. The father didn't know how to act. Should he report the call to the police, provide them with all the details, and let them handle the search for his son? Or should he gather the ransom money and hand it over to the kidnappers? The question that kept running through his mind was, if I pay the ransom, will the kidnapper actually return my son alive? But before we dive into our story, don't forget to like and share this episode so it reaches as many people as possible. Subscribe to the WhatsApp channel to stay updated. You'll find the link in the description box. Without further ado, let's dive into the depths of our story. Our story takes place in India, specifically in the city of Bengaluru, which is located in the state of Karnataka. There was a young man named Tushar Kumar, who was 21 years old at the time of the incident. Tushar was not originally from Bengaluru. He was living there for his studies. However, he had spent his entire life with his family in the city of Patna. Tushar's family was very close-knit, not just his parents and siblings, but also his extended family, who shared a strong bond and excellent relationships with one another. His father, Pramod Mehta, worked as a real estate contractor, and financially they were well off. The Kumar family was well known in Patna for owning several properties and being a wealthy household. However, Tushar never relied on his father's wealth. From a young age, he was known for his exceptional intelligence and his dedication to his studies. He had always dreamed of one day graduating from university with an engineering degree, and during high school, he worked extremely hard to achieve grades that would qualify him for admission to an engineering institute. His efforts paid off, and he was accepted into Sri Krishna Institute of Technology, located in Bengaluru. Since Bengaluru was very far from Patna, Tushar had to rent an apartment to live in during his studies. His family was initially worried that living alone might affect his academic performance, as he would no longer be under their supervision. However, living alone did not change his habits or his disciplined lifestyle. He remained just as committed to his university studies as he had been back home. This made his family extremely proud, and they eagerly counted down the days until he would graduate and return to Patna to live with them again. Unfortunately, this happiness was soon interrupted. On January 16, 2011, Tushar's father received a phone call. As soon as he answered, the caller started by asking for his name and whether he was, in fact, Tushar's father. At that moment, Pramod Mehta confirmed that Tushar was indeed his son. The caller then responded, telling him that he had kidnapped his son and was holding him captive. He demanded a ransom of 1 million rupees, approximately $11,000, and instructed him to deliver the money in Bengaluru. The caller also warned him that if he contacted the police or revealed any details about the phone call, he would immediately end his son's life, and he would never see him alive again. At that point, the father was willing to do anything to get his son back. He began gathering the ransom money, and by that evening, he had it ready. He booked a flight from Patna to Bengaluru, and as soon as he arrived, he met Tushar's friend, Ayushman. Pramod, Tushar's father, knew Ayushman very well. He knew that he and his son had been friends since childhood. Ayushman was also from Patna, and he was a friend and schoolmate of Tushar. You could say that the families of Tushar and Ayushman had known each other for years, and a strong friendship had developed between them. In fact, Ayushman shared the same dream as Tushar, to obtain an engineering degree. Both of them worked hard and enrolled in the same university. Since they were both from the same city but were now living in a completely different one, Tushar decided to rent an apartment and share it with Ayushman so they could stay together and support each other without feeling lonely. When Pramod met Ayushman, he began asking him questions since they lived in the same apartment with Tushar. He asked when the last time Ayushman had seen Tushar was. Ayushman replied that the last time he saw him was on January 14, 2011. When the father asked whether Tushar had mentioned where he was going, who he was meeting, or if he was traveling somewhere for a while, Ayushman began explaining the situation. He said that on January 14th, he and Tushar had gone to a shopping mall. There, they met two girls who introduced themselves as sisters. He mentioned that he and Tushar sat with the girls and engaged in conversation. However, suddenly, one of the girls spoke to Tushar, and shortly after, Tushar pulled Ayushman aside. Tushar told Ayushman that he should return home because it wouldn't be appropriate for him to go with the girls. At that moment, Ayushman didn't want to put himself in an awkward situation, so he left them at the mall and returned home. He said that, after getting home, he focused on his studies and then went to sleep. However, in the middle of the night, he became anxious and started moving around the house. He entered Tushar's room, but when he did, he discovered that Tushar was not there. The situation seemed very strange to him, so he decided to check on Tushar and called him on his phone, but he discovered that Tushar's phone was switched off. At first, Ayushman didn't pay much attention to the situation. He thought it was possible that Tushar was spending time with one of the girls, since he had shown interest in one of them. He assumed there was no need to worry, so he went back to sleep. However, the next morning, on January 15, 2011, Ayushman discovered that Tushar still hadn't returned home, even though they were supposed to go to university together for their lectures. When he tried calling Tushar again, his phone was still switched off, and Ayushman couldn't reach him in any way. When Pramod, Tushar's father, asked Ayushman why he hadn't contacted anyone to report that Tushar was missing or hadn't returned home since Ayushman had last seen him, Ayushman replied that he thought Tushar was probably spending time with one of the girls since he was attracted to one of them. Ayushman didn't want to cause unnecessary concern over a situation that he believed might not have been something to worry about. At that moment, Pramod had a strong feeling that the situation was very dangerous. He wondered if he should give the ransom money to the kidnappers, hoping that they would return Tushar, or if they would just take the money and end his son's life. The thought of whether he would ever see his son alive again left him deeply confused and uncertain. As I mentioned before, Tushar's family was very close-knit, so Pramod decided to contact his siblings in Patna, explaining the situation to them and asking for their advice. They all advised him that the best course of action to ensure his son's safety was to immediately contact the police, as they would be able to find the kidnappers. When Pramod asked about where he should report his son's disappearance, he discovered that a police station had recently opened near the house where his son had been living. That was the place where he was supposed to file the report. However, the challenge Pramod faced at that time, which was quite surprising to him, was that this police station had only recently opened. Most of the officers there were either fresh graduates or had very little experience. Because of this, Pramod was worried that they might not take his report seriously. He then decided to contact some acquaintances and people he had worked with to try and get recommendations so that the police would pay attention to his report. Indeed, a person Pramod had worked with managed to get in touch with some inspectors in Bengaluru who provided a direct recommendation to one of the inspectors at the police station. They informed him that Pramod and Ayushman would be coming to the police station to report the disappearance of Tushar and that the case needed to be solved no matter what. When the police received the report, they were shocked and confused, as Pramod said. As soon as he arrived and filed the report, the officers looked at each other as if they didn't know how to handle the situation. It became clear that this police station had not received any reports before, hadn't solved any cases, and hadn't arrested anyone or even handcuffed anyone. The police station was still new. Pramod even mentioned that he could smell the paint as soon as he walked into the station. However, let me tell you that the officers took the matter as a challenge and wanted to prove that they could solve any case. The head inspector at the police station started asking Pramod for all the details and the timeline of the events. Pramod explained to him about the phone call he had received, and Ayushman began explaining the last time he saw Tushar, after which he completely disappeared without any trace. At that time, the chief inspector requested Tushar's phone number to try and contact him. However, when they called, as I mentioned earlier, his phone was switched off and they couldn't reach him. So, they started investigating the last location where the phone signal was detected before it was turned off. They discovered that the last signal from the phone had appeared at the shopping center where Ayushman said he and Tushar had been together the last time. They then asked Pramod, Tushar's father, to provide the number that had called him to demand the ransom. When they called that number, they found that it was also switched off. However, they decided to keep the number under surveillance in case the caller tried to contact Pramod again to collect the ransom money. This way, they could possibly trace the location, arrest the kidnapper, and rescue Tushar. Then, they received a phone call from someone who reported a strange event happening at a neighbor's house. When the police asked about the nature of the event, the person explained that the house next door had a newlywed couple, and he had seen them in the early afternoon bringing a young man into their house. He estimated the young man's age to be in his early 20s, and it seemed like they were trying to silence him and prevent him from speaking. They were tying him up and forcefully bringing him into the house. The police immediately went to the house of the person who had called them and asked him to identify Tushar's photo to confirm whether he was the same young man he had seen being taken into the neighbor's house. However, the witness couldn't clearly identify the young man's features, only stating that he was in his early 20s. Therefore, the police realized they needed to find out more about the newlywed couple and what exactly was going on. When the police knocked on the couple's door, they discovered that they weren't home. So, they decided to wait for them. Later that evening, when the couple returned home, the police took them into custody and began questioning them. They also asked the couple to open their house so that they could search it thoroughly. After searching every corner of the house, they found no trace of Tushar. When they confronted the couple and asked about their relationship with Tushar, if they knew him, and who the young man they had been holding in their house was, the couple was completely confused and had no idea what was going on. The couple's names were Sanjana and Karen, and they had been married for less than 3 months. They assured the police officers that they had never seen Tushar and didn't know anyone by the name of Tushar. They began to explain the situation that the neighbor had seen. Sanjana told the police officers that the person they were tying up, trying to silence and forcefully bringing into the house was her younger brother. She said that before her marriage she had lived with her family in Mumbai and had moved to Bengaluru after her marriage because of her husband Karen's job. She explained that her family had discovered one day that her brother Arjun was addicted to drugs. On the day they confronted him about it, he ran away from home. When her family contacted her by phone, as they were sure that Arjun would come to her house, they found that he had indeed arrived. As soon as he got there, she and her husband began tying him up and bringing him into the house to later send him to a rehabilitation center in Mumbai. She said that her family arrived at her house, took Arjun with them, and that she and her husband were not home at that time because they had taken her family to the starting point of the road. The police, when they went to the rehabilitation center Sanjana and Karen had mentioned, confirmed their statements. They verified that the couple was in a completely different location and had no involvement with what happened to Tushar. They concluded that the scene the neighbor had witnessed, where they thought the couple had kidnapped someone and were holding him in their house, was a misunderstanding. At that point, the police had no choice but to wait for another phone call from the people who had kidnapped Tushar. However, on January 18, 2011, Pramod, Tushar's father, received a phone call from the kidnapper. The call was short and quick, and during it, the kidnapper told Pramod to go to the train station in Bengaluru to deliver the ransom there. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the call was so brief that the police couldn't pinpoint the location, but the police were able to gather some information from the call while it was happening. The people who had kidnapped Tushar told his father to go to the train station and to carry the ransom money in a silver Samsonite suitcase. They said they would recognize him by the suitcase he was carrying. At that time, Pramod told them he would do everything they wanted, but his only request was to hear his son's voice, even if it was just for once. However, as soon as Pramod made this request, they ended the call immediately. The phone call was very tense for Pramod, and he was worried about his son's safety because he feared that the people who had kidnapped his son had noticed that the police were listening to the call or monitoring the phone. Because of this, they ended the call quickly. However, the police reassured him at that moment that no one would be able to tell if anyone else was listening to the call or if anyone was tracking the phone's location. At that point, the police had a plan they needed to execute quickly. They were going to go to the train station, but they made sure they didn't wear police uniforms. They dressed in ordinary clothes, pretending to be shopkeepers, train passengers, or any other person at the station. The plan had to seem completely normal and not raise any suspicion. Even the chief inspector at the time insisted that the officers wear different shoes from the ones typically worn by police officers because there was a chance that the kidnapper could be very smart and observant. Therefore, they didn't want any mistakes to ruin their plan. The police took the ransom money from Pramod, but they didn't place all the money inside the suitcase as the kidnappers had requested. Instead, they put newspapers and ordinary useless papers inside the suitcase, placing only part of the ransom money on top so that the operation would seem completely natural, and they could confirm that this was the person who had kidnapped Tushar. They told Pramod that the plan would be for him to go to the train station, act completely normal, wait for the kidnapper to arrive, take the suitcase from him, and not move from his position even after the kidnapper took the suitcase. Indeed, Pramod arrived there and waited for a while. Then a person approached him, whispered in his ear, took the suitcase from his hand, and began to walk away. At that moment, as I mentioned earlier, the police were stationed all around the train station disguised as ordinary people. The young man took the suitcase and walked a short distance before opening it to check the money inside. The police officers immediately apprehended him and began questioning him about the location of Tushar. Once the young man saw the police, he began to provide them with all the details and information they wanted, and even the ones they didn't ask for. He told them that his name was Rohit Kumar and that the plan against Tushar and his father Pramod wasn't carried out by him alone. When they asked him who the second person involved with him was, he took them to a different part of the train station, away from where they had been. As soon as the police arrived there, they discovered that Rohith's partner was waiting for him, ready to take the suitcase back to him. The young man, upon seeing the police, tried to escape, but the officers surrounded him and arrested him. Both of them were taken to the police station to figure out their story. Once they arrived at the station, they discovered the second man's name was Waris. At that moment, everyone at the station was very happy, thinking that they had caught the kidnappers, and that, since Pramod had not paid the ransom, they had successfully solved the case, which was the first case handled by the new police station. In order to find out where Tushar was being held, they needed to interrogate both Rohith Kumar and Waris. During the interrogation, both of them gave multiple versions of the story. Initially, they said they had indeed taken Tushar, beaten him, taken his phone, and then let him go, not knowing anything about him after that. After a while, they began to change their story, claiming that they had been holding him in a room at one of the small hotels in Bengaluru. Since their story kept changing every time they spoke, the police officers realized that they wouldn't easily admit to their actions. Therefore, they began to corner them with questions and press them for answers using their tactics. At that time, Rohith Kumar and Waris decided to tell the police the full truth. However, they told the police that in order to discover the truth, they needed to take them to a location that they would specify. The police took them to an area outside the boundaries of Bengaluru, a completely desolate area. They began to enter a region within the desert, isolated and far from the road. There, the police discovered Tushar's body. When they started to examine his body, they confirmed that he had been killed several days earlier. Even Rohith and Waris had not bothered to bury him or hide him. They had left him out in the open, seemingly confident that no one would search for them or discover their crime. But don't think the shock ended there. The situation turned out to be much more complicated. Since Rohith and Waris had been fully exposed, they began to confess to the police that they weren't the only ones involved. There were two other people involved in the crime, two women named Preeti Raj and Shivani Thakur. Shivani worked at a restaurant in one of the shopping centers, and Preeti worked with her in the same mall but at a different store. The two were very close friends. Waris also studied engineering with Ayushman and Tushar. However, after about a year, Waris didn't continue his second year of studies and decided to give up his engineering degree. Since he didn't want to face his family with his failure, he decided to stay in Bengaluru and not return to them. During his time in Bengaluru, Waris frequently visited the mall and met Shivani there, as he would spend time in the restaurant where she worked. A friendship developed between them, which later turned into a romantic relationship. During the time Waris was talking to Shivani, he would always mention Tushar, how much he envied him, and how Tushar was a rich, financially comfortable young man, and all the dreams he had dreamed were fulfilled. In contrast, Waris felt like he hadn't been able to achieve anything in his own life. When Shivani started listening to Waris's words, she began to gather some information from him. She went to her account on one of the social media platforms and started searching for Tushar's account. She was able to find it and even managed to contact him, trying to establish a friendship. At that time, Tushar had no idea about the connection between his former university colleague, Waris, and Shivani. He believed that she was a girl he had met randomly, and a mutual admiration had developed between them. They continued their interaction for a while through social media. On January 12, 2011, Shivani asked Tushar to meet her at one of the restaurants in a shopping mall. Tushar at that time did not know that Shivani worked there, and he thought he was just going to meet her for the first time. He indeed went and met Shivani, sat with her, and their mutual attraction grew after meeting face to face. On that occasion, Shivani asked Tushar to meet her again on January 13, 2011. However, Tushar told her that he had exams and would be unavailable. He promised, though, that he could meet her on January 14th, 2011. At that time, Shivani told him that she wouldn't come alone and would bring her sister, Preeti. For the record, Preeti was actually Shivani's friend, not her sister, but that's what Shivani told Tushar when talking about Preeti. For this reason, Tushar informed his friend and roommate, Ayushman, as I mentioned earlier, and asked him to join him when he went to meet Shivani. Shivani later confessed to the police that she was surprised when Ayushman showed up with Tushar, as she hadn't expected that at all. She sat down and started thinking. After a while, she went and spoke to Tushar, telling him that she was inviting him to a party at her sister's house. However, she mentioned that the party would be very private and the place was small, so it wouldn't be possible for his friend to come with him. As I mentioned earlier, Tushar was very attracted to Shivani and wanted to spend more time with her. So he went and spoke to his friend Ayushman, asking him to return to their house alone. Ayushman couldn't bring himself to say anything to his friend or make things awkward, so he returned home, leaving Tushar with Shivani and Preeti at the mall. Shivani said that once they arrived there, they started sitting and drinking some beverages. At that time, she was sitting at home with Preeti and Tushar only. After a while, the door started knocking, and the person knocking at the door was Waris. When he entered the house, he began interacting with Shivani and made it clear to Tushar that they were emotionally involved and that she was his girlfriend. Of course, Tushar was shocked at that moment because the girl he liked and who he thought he came to visit to spend some time with turned out to be in a relationship with a former university colleague. The situation was very confusing for him and began raising many questions in his mind. He didn't understand why she was getting emotionally close to him while she was already involved with someone else. However, Shivani said that even though it was obvious that Tushar was shocked when he saw Waris, he tried to calm himself down and act normally. After a short while, he made an excuse that he had some lessons and lectures to attend, so he asked for permission to leave and go back home. At that time, Waris intervened and started preventing Tushar from leaving. However, he was doing so in a friendly manner, suggesting that they sit and talk for a while. But Tushar refused all the offers Waris was making. That's when Waris suggested that they play a game of hide and seek. Tushar was very surprised by the suggestion and didn't understand why he was being asked to stay and play such a game. He told Waris that they were not children to be playing games like that. Waris then told him that they would play the game, but in a different way to have fun and spend some time. When Tushar asked what kind of game he wanted to play, Waris told him that he should send a voice message to his father, Pramod, and tell him in the message that he had been kidnapped by some people who were demanding a ransom of 10 million rupees. Of course, when Tushar heard this, he completely rejected the idea and thought that Waris was joking, and his joke was very silly. All Tushar wanted at that moment was to leave the house immediately. However, Waris kept repeating his request, and each time he lowered the amount, first saying, "Let's make it 7 million rupees," then another time 5 million rupees, or 3 million rupees. But each time Tushar completely refused. The situation between them started to escalate, and with each rejection of Waris's request, Waris became increasingly angry. In his rage, he grabbed a bottle that was nearby and hit Tushar on the head with it forcefully. At that moment, Tushar was in pain, screaming and trying to call for help from everyone who was there. He looked at Shivani and Preeti, who were sitting with their arms crossed, watching him, but not doing anything. At that point, Waris said that he was afraid someone might hear Tushar's screams, and he needed to silence him. He realized the only way to silence him was to grab his neck and start choking him until he breathed his last. Of course, after ending Tushar's life, he didn't know what to do. neither he nor Shivani nor Preethi. Therefore, he turned to his friend Rohith and asked him to come, explaining that he had ended someone's life and that they should go and dispose of the body. Rohith didn't say a word, didn't argue, or question him. He just took the body of Tushar from the house, and the four of them got into a car and went to a secluded desert area outside the limits of Bengaluru city, where they dumped the body. After that, they returned home again. When they got back to the house, they weren't scared or feeling any guilt at all. In fact, they were blaming Tushar, saying that he was the one who caused the whole catastrophe. They said, "What's the big deal if he had asked his father to give them 10 million rupees?" At that point, Waris sat and thought, saying, "We need to make the most of the situation." When the three of them asked him how they could benefit from the situation despite Tushar's life being over, he told them that Tushar's father didn't know his son was dead, and that they would call Tushar's father, tell him that they had kidnapped his son, and demand a ransom. They would tell him to come to Bengaluru and give them the money at the train station. Afterward, they would disappear completely, and the father would report the matter to the police. They would either find Tushar's body or not, but that wasn't their concern. It was a terribly foolish idea, but the four of them saw it as an excellent plan to get a large amount of money easily. Since Waris knew that Ayushman was living with Tushar in the same house, it was likely that he would report the disappearance to his family, so he decided to wait for 2 days. The crime took place on January 14, 2011, and the phone call that reached Pramod, Tushar's father, happened on January 16, 2011. Waris explained that his plan was to create panic within Tushar's family, making them willing to pay the ransom no matter the cost. As I mentioned earlier in the investigation, it was Rohith Kumar and Waris who led the police to the names Preethi Raj and Shivani Thakur. Preethi and Shivani left Bengaluru as soon as they learned that the police had started searching for Tushar. They went to Mumbai, where the police were able to arrest them and bring them back to Bengaluru to stand trial. However, the surprise came when the police began examining the phones of Preethi and Shivani. They discovered that this was not the first time the two of them had committed a crime together. Before they even met Waris and Rohit, the two of them were already luring young men from social media, forming relationships with them, and in some cases, taking compromising photos. They would then blackmail the men with those photos to extort money from them. This had been a recurring issue, and there were several reports describing Preethi and Shivani. However, because they kept changing their names and the locations where they committed their crimes, no one had been able to catch them. Preethi and Shivani claimed that their plan was simply to lure Tushar, get to know him, and then blackmail him for money. They never intended to end his life, and they said that Waris was the one who took the plan in a different direction. No one had agreed on this outcome. The case remained in court from 2011 until 2014, and the ruling in 2014 was catastrophic. The judge said that since Preethi, Shivani, Rohith, and Waris were all under the age of 25 and had no criminal records, they should not be treated harshly, and a major punishment was unnecessary. They were sentenced to only 10 years in prison. Of course, this turned everything upside down. Tushar's father, Pramod, filed appeals against the ruling multiple times because he believed these people were criminals. They had devised a plan to kidnap his son, extort money from him, and ultimately ended his life. They were determined to get a ransom, and he felt they should be punished for all their actions. Unfortunately, each time Pramod appealed, the court rejected it, and it wasn't until 2024 that anything changed. The Karnataka High Court accepted Pramod's appeal at that time, and they recognized that the argument that the defendants were under 25 and had no prior criminal record should not be considered, as the crime they committed was brutal. Therefore, on August 14, 2024, the court sentenced the four individuals to life imprisonment. Tushar certainly did not deserve such a tragic end. He was deceived by someone he thought was a fellow student and with whom he had a good relationship. Unfortunately, Waris envied everything that Tushar had: his family, his material wealth, his academic efforts, and literally everything. Unable to control his feelings of jealousy, he convinced Preeti and Shivani to lure Tushar to their home. However, he didn't stop there. He wanted to extort money from Tushar and also wanted to be involved in the crime by blackmailing Tushar's father for 10 million rupees. When Tushar refused to play along with the game Waris had devised, Waris saw no other solution but to end his life. He also wanted to use the love Tushar's father had for his son to extract money from him after his son's death. It was undoubtedly a demonic plan. When Tushar was lured in after Shivani played the role of love, it was just a honey trap. She only wanted to bring him to the house to either photograph him or blackmail him in some way. But Waris decided to take the situation in a different direction. His appearance in front of Tushar was intended to prove to him that Shivani was emotionally involved with him, aiming to break Tushar's spirit and show him that Shivani preferred him over Tushar. It was a way for Waris to satisfy his own ego by feeling that he had triumphed over Tushar. The only comfort for Tushar's family after the loss of their son was that the court overturned the very lenient punishment initially given to the four criminals, ultimately sentencing them to the punishment they truly deserved. Thus, we have reached the end of our story. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to leave a like and write in the comments whether you think Waris's plan from the beginning was to lure Tushar to end his life, or if it was a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by a fit of rage followed by a desire to exploit the situation. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell for notifications so you won't miss any new content. Stay tuned for the next episode. I would also like to express my heartfelt thanks to Mrs. Dina Abuhatab, as she is the writer and the original script owner of this episode. Goodbye.